The moment the conductor stands out on stage, everybody applauds. As the conductor walks out into the audience, sometimes hundreds, if not thousands of people erupt in applause well before the conductor has done anything. And there's a moment where the conductor raises her baton and a silence that is borderline unearthly falls over the entire crowd. Everything hangs on the conductor's baton. What happens next will be determined by her as she brings music into the sound of silence. But until she moves, there is nothing. Until she moves that hand in just the most intentional and deliberate way, there is only ever silence. But what does that silence sound like? That was the question that John Cage, an American composer, wanted to find out. And so he composed one of the most avant-garde pieces of music ever written, simply called 433. The conductor stands on stage, raises the baton, and then begins to move it in time with the piece. Except when you look at the score, there are no notes, there are no little dots that go up and down as the course of music flows and progresses and changes and ebbs and moves. There is only the single silent sound of the baton moving through the air. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the audience is invited to consider the sound of silence, to consider the rustling of a gum wrapper being opened, or to consider the tickle in your throat that just showed up out of nowhere. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, the audience is invited to consider the sound of silence. And any audience that exposes themselves and opens themselves up to the sound will find the same two things to be true. That silence is liquid, that it will rise to fill the level of whatever container you put it in. And that silence, true silence, is utterly deafening. Silence can be found anywhere, but it is incredibly hard to find good silence. Videographers who need to record specific sounds and need to find space to record lengthy pauses and breaks have found that the number of hours of recording that they need to do to capture 1 minute of silence has tripled in the last 3 decades. It is harder and harder to find moments of pure silence in our world. Whether it's the noise pollution of cars honking or the sound of planes flying overhead, or the simple act of chaos erupting through the breaking of a glass that was never meant to be broken, or whatever it is that happens, silence is a rare and increasingly rare commodity in our world. But this is what makes the story of Job so compelling. Job is invited not just to consider his relationship with God and all of the things that have made him so successful and all the things that have brought him into this space, but also to consider that what does it mean for him as a person who has never done anything wrong to be for that moment surrounded by silence. He calls out to God for help, and God does not answer. The realities of silence is that it is both incredibly hard to come by, and when we do find it, often we find ourselves in a situation that we don't know what to do with the silence that we have. So we find silence, and it makes us uncomfortable. Could you imagine if for 4 minutes and 33 seconds I stood up here and said nothing? Like we don't even have to imagine. Some of the recordings as we participate in this with our friends on YouTube, occasionally something goes wrong because technology is technology and none of the sound gets recorded. And there are videos of of me standing up here and gesticulating wildly and passionately. I'm clearly have something important that I want to tell people, and the silence on the recorded end is long and empty. And you know what the view count on those videos is? Silence makes us uncomfortable. We avoid silence where we can. And it is one of the biggest problems in our world. I realized this as I was reflecting on the act of silence this week, that when I was home by myself doing the dishes, by myself, in my house, by myself, I put headphones on to listen to music while I'm doing the dishes. I'm so terrified of the prospect that I might move too far away from my music and not be able to hear it, and I might be confronted with the reality of silence, that I strap giant noise-canceling headphones to my head and scrub the dishes. We have made silence not only rare in our world, but terrifying to comprehend, and so we find ourselves in a world that runs at a pace and runs in a way that makes our anxiety feel like there's nothing we can do about it. We feel like we're exhausted from all the noise around us, and yet we refuse to do the one thing that could actually help us, which is to embrace silence. So I wanted to try an experiment this week. I wanted to try to find as much of the sound of sheer silence as I could. And so while Beth was out with friends, I went down into the basement of our house, turned off all the lights, and sat cross-legged on the basement floor in pitch black and just listened to the sounds of my house. Now, as somebody who both doesn't like the dark, and not a big fan of the dark, and who doesn't particularly like sitting still and doing nothing, this was a weird experiment for me. It felt like a weird exercise. Not only because I had to convince myself that my basement is not haunted, it is not scary, there's nobody hiding around the corner in my basement that is going to jump out and get me. But it didn't make the prospect of walking down those stairs and sitting on the floor by myself in the dark in the middle of the night less daunting. If I had had headphones on, if I had had anything singing into my ear, singing into my experience, that other than the silence, it wouldn't have seemed quite so scary, quite so lonely. But this is the reality of the world in which we live. It is virtually impossible to find silence, and when we find it, it terrifies us, and because it is so terrifying, it is almost impossible to find somebody who will simply be present with you in that silence. Because silence terrifies us. It makes us uncomfortable. It makes us contend with the realities, not just of who we are, but of what we are. Which is why I think that the David story is so impactful. The Israelites in David's day are faced with the noise of a marauding army that they don't think that they can actually stand up against. They don't think that they can go toe-to-toe with these Philistines because they have a Goliath. They have a giant who is easily almost 8 feet tall, standing on the other side of a valley, yelling mockery and insults at the people of God. The Israelites know that they have nobody who can go toe-to-toe with Goliath in a fair fight. He is too big, too strong, too powerful, too mighty. And so when David, the youngest son of Jesse, the shepherd, comes up to bring his brothers who are serving on the battle line lunch, David finds himself in a pickle. He says, how can it be that there's no one in Israel who's willing to stand up against Goliath? How can this be the world we live in? Aren't we God's people? don't we believe that that the God who brought us out of Egypt is going to continue, and has promised that he's going to continue to fight our battles for us, is going to not let us lose to Goliath? And so David is the only one who's willing to go toe-to-toe with Goliath. The only one who says, I will take his champion's duel. I will go and I will meet Goliath in single combat, and I will win, not because of my own strength, but because God has said that he will not let us be defeated. Saul does what every sensible, reasonable person would do in this situation. He takes his own suit of armor and places it on David's shoulders. Saul, we're told, is already a head taller than everybody else in the nation. He's tall, he's strong, he's handsome, and so as this armor that is custom built for him out of probably a bronze alloy is placed on this small, feeble shepherd's shoulders, it feels like a kid wearing their dad's shoes. You know, if you've seen a kid put on shoes that are just way too big for them and run around, it's hard not to laugh, even when they fall over. It's hard not to look at this as just a ridiculous setup. And here's David, a boy, maybe not even yet at puberty, wearing armor fit for a man, holding a sword that he has never had a chance to practice with, that he's never had a chance to wield. And he is told, if you want to go toe-to-toe with Goliath, bless you. Thank you for being brave enough, because no one else is. Here's the armor you need. Here's the weapon you need. Here's the stuff you need. Go and do what you need to do. And David is faced with a choice. He can go with the sensible choice, the armor that's going to protect him from a blow, the helmet that might feel a little wobbly but is going to keep his head safe, the sword that is the only thing that has a chance of falling a giant. Or David can take all of it off. He can take all of the armor off, set it aside, and go to the brook. David goes to the brook, and where the only sound is the simple babbling noise of water flowing over rocks, turning those rocks from jagged pieces of sediment into smooth stones that can be used as a projectile in a shepherd's sling. We often think that the solution to our problems is going to be bigger armor. It's going to be more protection. It's going to be more plans, more stuff, more ideas, more thoughts, more activities and actions. It's going to be to simply do more. We put on armor that's too big for us, because we forget that the fundamental thing about any story is that David is not the hero of David's story. God is. David doesn't kill Goliath. God does. And by the same token, God doesn't call us to fight our own battles. God doesn't call us to arm ourselves, and even when the armor doesn't fit, and to swing the sword that we've never practiced with. God calls us to put those things aside, because they are loud and they are distracting, and they are not how we are called to fight. And to be like David, to go and find that quiet place in our world where the steady, repetitive act of the river being the river, the brook being the brook, can give us exactly what we need. This is what silence can do. Silence gives us the freedom to not just do something, but to stand there. To not just do something, but to stand there. To stand and be present and say, you're not with us in the thunderclap. You're not with us in the storm. You're not with us in the hurricane winds. You are with us in the sound of sheer silence. When Job is faced with the reality of a world that feels indifferent and silent and empty, there is a point at which he is invited to realize that this is the place where he is in fact closest to God. Because God can and does speak through enormous cosmic activities. God makes everything. God will do miraculous things. I have seen God act in big, bold ways that can only be attributed to God. But I've also learned that when you find that space for silence, the voice of God can be clear and profound. Silence is rare in our world. It is rare in our world for there to be anything that is simply left open and vulnerable. Because we've bought into a lie that says that noise and stuff and activities and all of these things are what are going to keep us safe. That if we fill our life to the brim, that is the only way we can hold on to it. Silence, alternatively, invites us into a different story. Silence invites us into a space that says the things in my life are not ultimately mine to begin with. I can take time. I don't have to defend them with my words. I don't have to name them with my abilities. I don't have to understand them or comprehend them or come to the bottom of them. I simply have to be with them. Silence is the invitation to understand that being is more important and more impactful than doing. God has called us to be. And in silence we find our ability to be. In silence we find our ability to be shouted down by the noise around us. In silence, we rescue that ability to be. In silence, we find ourselves grappling with all of the reasons that silence scares us in the first place. We find ourselves grappling with our own insecurities and our own anxieties, our own depressions, our own fears and failures. Silence brings all of these things out to the front. And when you can contend with them, when you can embrace them, when you can understand that these things are part and parcel with who you are, that they're not things to be drowned out, but that they are things to be understood and grappled with and embraced, then God can begin the work of moving from silence into speaking. There's a moment in Job's story. We don't know exactly where it is, but there's a moment right before his friends show up that I believe Job is sitting there on the ground wondering why this is happening to him when he has done nothing wrong. Why this is the world that Job has been forced to encounter and inhabit and be part of. And for a moment, the sound of God's voice says, "Here I am." Like Elisha on the mountain, the sound of sheer silence is how God speaks. God doesn't force himself into your life. God doesn't force you to do anything that you don't want to do. C.S. Lewis said that there are two kinds of people in this world. There are those there are those who say to God, "Thy will be done," and there are those to whom God will say, "Fine, have it your way." The reality of silence is that it is what makes space for God to speak. And when you find silence in your life, when you find silence in your day, when you find silence in your moments, you can learn to listen and hear the voice of God. There is silence in our suffering. There is suffering in our silence. There is silence in our world. And what we do with it and how we speak into it can be all the difference. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. For it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.